Hey team! Alright, so we've reached one of my absolute favorite units in our course. We are now going to be jumping into the evolution unit. This is really exciting because this is one of the major big ideas in biology. It kind of ties everything together, and then it's also going to set us up to talk about all the different diversity of life on our planet, which is really cool. Okay, we're going to define what evolution is, and then we're going to talk about natural selection, one of the mechanisms of evolution. And then later on, we're going to jump into other ways that evolution can happen, and then the process of speciation. All right, let's get to it. I'm so excited. All right, so the reason why evolution is such a big idea is because it unifies all of biology together. It's a theory that can explain many phenomena within biology. And many different aspects of biology can and really should be viewed through an evolutionary lens, asking how does this matter or how does this change when we think about things in an evolutionary sense, right? And that'll become more clear as we move through this unit. So what do we mean by it unifies biology? Well, evolution, the theory of evolution, explains both the unity and the diversity of life on Earth. So what does that mean? That means it explains how all of life is related to each other, how it explains the relation between us and all other organisms, between bacteria and everything else. It explains that we all share a common ancestor. And it also explains why is there so much life on our planet to begin with. It explains the diversity of life. So it explains why aren't there just 3 species? Why are there millions, upwards of 10 million plus species on our planet? So both of these big ideas, the unity, how everything is related, and why are there so many different forms of life on our planet, both of these can be explained through the process of evolution, through the lens of evolution. So our first big idea when we're talking about evolution is this idea of descent with modification. And what that means is that all living organisms are going to share a common ancestor, and then through small changes that are acquired, small genetic changes that are required, the offspring of that next generation are going to be slightly different than their parents. And if we play this idea out, those small changes over long periods of time, we can start to see how all of life is related. And it's through this process of descent with modification that one ancestor, one living organism, common ancestor, gave rise to all of the different forms of life that we see today on our planet. And this has been documented in the fossil record, and we'll talk about some of the evidence for evolution, including the fossil record, a little bit later on. But how does this happen, right? So on a smaller scale, when we're not talking about all of life, when we're talking about it on a smaller scale, we're talking about evolution usually within a population. Population being all organisms that are living in a certain area that are also interbreeding. Alright, so that's a big idea here. A population. We measure evolution on the population level. See all the organisms in a given area. They're living in that area together, and then also interbreeding. Because that interbreeding is important because that means they're going to be mixing genetic information. Okay? And so when we see changes in the frequencies of alleles, or another way to say that, when we see over time the composition of that population changes, the genetic composition. So here we go, this first population, we see it's probably around 90% green beetles and about 10% brown beetles, right? And then let's say the next generation, we see it's flipped. We see about like 80% brown beetles and about 20% green, right? So that means that this allele, that gene that allows these beetles to be brown, and this gene that allows these beetles to be green, that allele, that frequency, how common it is, has changed over a generation, right? And that's really how we are going to be measuring evolution. We're going to be measuring evolution on a population level, and we're tracking how common or uncommon, we're tracking the frequencies of these alleles over time, over many generations. So we're going to talk about one of the key mechanisms of evolution first. We're going to talk about the mechanism of evolution that causes adaptive evolution, and that's going to be natural selection. So what does this mean, adaptive evolution? Well, an adaptation is any characteristic or trait that increases the likelihood of an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment, right? So adaptations can take on many different shapes and forms. Adaptations in humans could be things like skin color, hair color, our size, how tall we are, things like that. Adaptations in other organisms, plants, could be the size of their leaves, what if they have spines or not, right? Or how efficient they are at bringing in carbon dioxide and minimizing water loss, right? So adaptations can be many different things. They can be enzymes, they can be physical structures. But this mechanism that we're going to talk about, natural selection, is the only mechanism of evolution. It's the only cause of evolution that results in adaptive evolution, or organisms being better suited to their environment, being more likely to survive and reproduce in their environment. Right? And this is kind of what Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace are famous for. They're famous for coming up and defining this idea of natural selection and explaining how species change over time and how they become better suited to their environment. Okay? So there's 3 major requirements for natural selection. The first being that characteristics are inherited through generations. Okay, so we talked about this when we talked about trait inheritance, how offspring are a combination of the genes from either parent, right? So we are similar to our parents, but we're not identical. Okay, and so these characteristics, these genes, Darwin didn't know about genes at this time, but he saw that offspring are going to be similar to their parents and that these characteristics are going to be inherited through these generations, right? So here we have mama bird feeding these baby birds. Baby birds look like mama bird because they share 50% of her genes. And so when DNA came on the scene, we started to figure out that DNA was the genetic information. That was a huge breakthrough in evolution. Because in order for natural selection, in order for this process, this mechanism to act on a trait, to act on a characteristic, that trait must be heritable. Okay, so what that means is that natural selection can only function on traits which are inherited. Okay, it cannot function on traits that are learned. That's a whole other type of evolution. That's cultural evolution or social evolution. We're only focused on biological evolution, right? So the trait must be genetically determined in some way, and it's got to be passed from parent to offspring. Our second big idea in natural selection is that more offspring are going to be produced every generation than that environment can support. Each individual organism needs a certain amount of resources to survive. It needs a certain amount of space, it needs a certain amount of food, it needs a certain amount of water, nutrients, whatever, right? And so there are more offspring that are born into every generation than that environment can support. Right, so let's see, we have this row of ducklings here, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 9 little ducklings sitting right here, right? Let's say maybe this pond is really only large enough to produce 7, okay? So 2 of these ducklings would not be able to survive, right? And this is an idea that stems from somebody called Thomas Malthus, which is the idea that as populations increase in size, they're going to have a greater demand on their resources, right? And he was really concerned with, he was an economist, he was concerned with production of food, right? And so if there's not enough food to go around, not everybody's going to be able to survive. And so that's one of the major mechanisms that's going to lead to evolution. This is one of the parts of natural selection that can help lead to adaptive evolution. All right, so traits are heritable. More individuals, more offspring are produced each year, each generation than that environment can support. And then our third big idea is that there is variation in these offspring. Not all of these offspring are genetically identical, and that variation is inherited, right? So let's say of our ducklings, we said 7 were going to survive, right? Let's say those 7 that are surviving, they are able to survive because they can swim really fast and catch lots of food, maybe. And the 2 that aren't able to survive, maybe they didn't get that gene. They can't swim as fast, right? Maybe the webbing on their feet isn't as extensive, so they can't paddle their feet as fast. They can't swim as fast, right? But that variation that we see in these populations is inherited, and not all that variation is going to be suited to the environment, right? But where does that variation come from originally? Well, like we talked about when we talked about transcription and translation, that variation arises through mutations. So mutations, swapping out letters in that DNA, either through accident in DNA replication, those are going to cause a change to the gene sequence, which can then result in a different phenotype, a different physical characteristic, a different protein being produced, right? So here we have these two cats, right? This cat has normal ears. It has a normal gene, which means it's going to produce, when that gene is transcribed and translated, it's going to produce a normally shaped protein. Versus this mutated gene over here on the right, we've swapped some of those DNA bases around. Some sort of mutation has occurred, which means that the protein doesn't form properly anymore, which means now its ears are going to be all folded backwards, right? So these causes of these variation can be very diverse. It can be something from the environment, think like UV radiation or carcinogens or something. It can be an error in DNA replication, or that recombination of genes during meiosis, that swapping of genes, that crossing over, that can also lead to genetic variation as well. Okay? But whether or not a mutation is positive, negative, or neutral, whether it's going to help the individual or it's going to hurt the individual or it's going to have no effect at all, really depends upon the environment in which that mutation is working in. Right? So let's say we have one mutation for fur color where that mouse is white, right? That mutation might have a negative impact if this white mouse is living in a really dark environment. Let's say it's living on black rocks, right? That white mouse is going to stand out. Versus this mutation right here, that same environment, this black mouse now is going to be beneficial. It's going to be a beneficial environment. Right? So the environment in which that mutation is acting is what determines if that mutation is good or bad or neutral. So if we take all these ideas together, that leaves us, we can kind of tie them all together, and that brings us to our big idea here, where those offspring that are born, that have characteristics or traits, that have a genotype and then a phenotype, that allow them to better compete for access to these limited resources. So that means that they're better at competing for access for food, for access for space, for habitat, for mates, whatever they need to survive. Offspring that are better at competing for these limited resources, as opposed to offspring that are brought into that generation that are not as good at competing. Those that are better at competing are more likely to survive because they're more likely to get food and nutrients and water and space, as opposed to those that are not as likely to survive. Okay, as opposed to those that are not as likely to compete as well. And those that are more likely to compete better, they're more likely to survive, and they can also reproduce at a higher rate, which means they're going to have a higher fitness, a greater fitness. Right? So this idea of fitness is that those individuals with genotypes that are better suited for an environment, genotypes and phenotypes that are better suited for an environment, are more likely to survive and therefore reproduce, right? So fitness is all about reproduction. It's all about the number of offspring that an individual produces. And that number of offspring an individual produces is based on the combination of genes that it has and the characteristics that it inherited, right? So that's our big picture view of natural selection, one of the mechanisms that leads to adaptive evolution.